All right, we're fortunate to have Laila Lalami here, with a good writer. And having a conversation here will be Carrie Cranston. He's with the American Writers Museum, kind of new over in Chicago. So I want to welcome you both.
So I just wanted to say thank you for letting me be here and to interview you. Your work is amazing, and I know that, on top of the fact that you're an essayist and you write a number of pieces, you're a professor of creative writing in California, you also have a PhD in linguistics. English is your third language, plus others. So with all of that, then you've become this novelist. You've got Hope and Other Dangerous Pursuits, Secret Sons, and of course, The Moor's Account, which won the American Book Award, which was an amazing book in and of its own right, along with the Arab American Book Award, the Hurston Wright Legacy Award, and being a finalist for the Pulitzer. Now, that was fantastic, but we get to talk today about your newest book, and again, having just finished it, it was spectacular, and I was deeply drawn into it, to the characters, and if you haven't read it yet, it's this work that looks at the idea of family and home and a number of other issues through 9 different people, and you've taken on all these different voices. So this was a very different book. We were just talking about this, and kind of my first question to you is, going from the Moor's Account to this book is a big jump. So what motivated you to tell this story?
That's a really good question. Thank you so much, Carrie, for doing this interview. Thank you to the American Sign Language interpreter. Thank you to all of you for being here. I know that there are a lot of things that you could be doing on a Saturday afternoon, so I really appreciate that you all came out here to hear me talk about this book. It is very different from the Moor's Account. The 2 books, one is a historical novel, one is set in California, in the here and the now. The idea came about in the summer of 2014. I had just turned in the copy edits for the Moor's Account, and I didn't really know what I would be working on next. I knew it wouldn't be a historical novel because, quite frankly, I felt exhausted from the work of doing research and all of that for the book, and I wanted a break. So my husband and I were on vacation in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, of all places. Beautiful place. And towards the tail end of that vacation, I got a text in the middle of the night from my sister telling me that our father had taken gravely ill and he was basically dying, and we had to fly to Morocco to be with him, and we might make it and we might not make it. And it was this sense of panic set in, and we scrambled and we flew to Morocco, and very fortunately, thanks to the miracles of modern medicine, he recovered completely. He was fine, but it was a close call. And after we spent time together and I returned to Los Angeles, I brought back that fear with me, and that it sort of brought home for me the unintended consequence of immigrating to the United States. When I moved to the United States, I came here to go to graduate school. I really had no intention of living here. I just wanted to do my coursework and return home to Morocco to write my dissertation and get a job as a college professor. But during graduate school, I met a man, yada, yada, yada. And so I became an immigrant. So I like to say that I became an immigrant by chance. And so when you're in your 20s and you're sort of, in love and you're young and, you decide that you're going to live in another country, it never occurs to you to consider what the sort of ripple effects of that decision 20 or 30 or 40 years later. And I'm at a stage now where my parents are getting older, and I really do live with a sense of fear that I'm not going to be there when they need me, and a sense of guilt that I'm not there when they need me. And that is a consequence of that choice that I made 20 years ago. And so once I realized that was kind of like a kernel, like an experience that I hadn't thought through before. I wondered if it might be something that I could explore in fiction. And so hence the idea of writing a book about this Moroccan family. The parents have immigrated to California in 1981. And the story opens in 2014 when the daughter finds out that her father has been killed in a hit and run and has to return. She lives in Oakland. She has to return to this very small town in the Mojave Desert where the family lives. And it's basically the story of this family and all of the consequences of the decision that her parents have made way back in 1981. So it is a family story. It's a story of grief. It's a story of, it's a mystery because you don't know exactly what happened in that hit and run and who was behind the wheel of the accident. It's a love story. It just explores different themes centered around the death of that Moroccan immigrant.
Okay. And so you mentioned, we talked about these voices, these 9 different narrators that we move back and forth between. Obviously there was a lot that went into that decision. Can you talk about why you went for such a large and diverse set of voices?
That's a really great question. So when I started working on the book in 2014, I wrote it from the perspective of 2 characters. It was Nora, the young woman who returns home when she finds out that her father has been killed, and this love interest, who's this man that she went to high school with and basically reconnects with when she returns to this town. And I went through 3 drafts, and I wrote the story exactly as you have it in The Other Americans. And by then I would say it was 2016, and I felt, okay, the book has a beginning, a middle, and an end. A bunch of stuff happens. It seems complete to me. It's time to turn it in to my editor. And I turned it in, and so my editor at Pantheon is a man named Errol MacDonald. He's this sort of legendary guy, but he read it, and he wrote me this very complimentary email. It was, full of, very nice things about the story. But what makes him a great editor, I think, is that he asks great questions. And so he was asking me about the sort of minor characters in the book, or the other people, not the 2 main ones, but everybody else in the book that I had created. And he said that they were so interesting, but that I had given them very short shrift in the book. And he wondered why it was. And had I considered maybe expanding the story to include some of them. And I have to tell you that when I had turned in the book to him, I felt that something was missing. But nonetheless, I turned it into him because I didn't know what else to do with it. I just felt like I was done and that was it. There was nothing else I could think to make it any better. And when he asked that question, I had the answer to what it was that was missing in the book, which is that I had gone through all this effort to create all of these really interesting characters with very complicated backstories, and very little of it was explored. And so when he asked me that question, it was kind of like a light bulb moment. And I remember we were talking on the phone, and I was waiting for a flight. I think I was going to Boston. And with that realization came the realization that this whole book had to be tossed. Everything that I had done had to be tossed out the window, and I had to start over. And I was in shock. I was like practically weeping at LAX. And
Worst place to be crying.
yes. I can laugh about it now, but I was not laughing at that moment. And so I thought, well, let's just see. I mean, what does he know, really? I mean, he has 30 years of experience editing books, but what does he know? So I thought I would try, I would try and see whether I was even interested in doing it in this way or whether I was capable. I just, let's just see what happens. And so I started working, and about 50 pages into this new draft, I knew that there was no going back because I was so engaged and interested and really, frankly, in love with these characters that I wanted to stay in their voices and to honor each of them by telling their stories. And it's through the gaps in between each of the voices that the story really kind of comes alive, because the reader can see things in the book that none of the characters is able to see because they can only see their own limited perspectives. But since you are reading all of theirs, as a reader, then you have the ability to piece things together in ways that they can't. And I just loved that effect. And then after, as I said, there was no going back. So then I went away for 2 years, and then I came back and I said, here's the book, and then after that we were done. We went into copy edits.
That's awesome. And I, having looked at these 9 characters, and like you said, they all become very interesting. They all have their own backstories. I have to imagine that as you thought about these different voices, obviously Nora and Jeremy are the 2 most important characters, but who was one of the characters you had the most fun inhabiting?
I mean, I have to tell you, this book was a joy to write from beginning to end. So it's really difficult to pick just one. I would say that the character of the mother was really, maybe because I'm getting older and I just, I can see these young people in the book being kind of like, doing the things that young people do. And so I think I enjoyed writing the perspective of the mother also because she's somebody who has second thoughts about the decision of immigrating. And conversely, I also enjoyed writing the father because he loved the idea that he's immigrated. So it was kind of like both sides of the same coin. So I kind of enjoyed writing them. The most challenging voice, however, was it was that of the neighbor. I would say was a bit more difficult to write. So.
And then along those lines, were there characters in the story that you tried to inhabit but found that you couldn't? I mostly think about Fiyero as one who doesn't get a voice but is an important character.
Yes, well, it's interesting. So Fiyero is basically this veteran of the Iraq War, and he's friends with one of the main characters in the book who also is a veteran. And Fiyero has a lot of trouble, I think, that predate anything that has to do with combat, but that combat has exacerbated. At one point, I did have a very brief section from his perspective, but I ended up taking it out because I felt that it didn't do much good. If it was going to be that short, then it would have been a disservice to him as a character, so I just ended up taking it out. I enjoyed writing sort of that friendship between the 2 of them and the complications of it and the fact that one of them is sort of moving on with his life and the other one isn't and is kind of stuck where, in that kind of just moment. So I did write from his perspective, but I ended up taking it out. So.
Okay. Is there I know you mentioned that you did a lot of research for, obviously, the Moor's account as historical fiction. But you did research for this, too. Can you talk a little bit about all the variety of research you wound up doing?
So remember how I said that I wanted to write a contemporary book because I was so tired of doing research. And it's amazing the lies that you have to tell yourself just to get yourself through the few years it's going to take to write a book. So I very naively thought, I live in California, I know the Mojave, how difficult is it going to be to write this book? I should be able to do it. And I really underestimated the amount of research that actually is needed. In order to write convincingly from 9 different perspectives, I needed to become intimate with their lives. And that meant, for example, if one of them is a sheriff's deputy, actually understanding what sheriff's deputy in San Bernardino County do. So I had to go on a ride-along with a sheriff's deputy, which anybody can do. You just have to sign up. And so you get to go into the in the passenger side, and you get to see what a 12-hour shift in the Mojave might look like, and the kind of things that they have to deal with. Something like a hit and run. You think, okay, a car comes out of nowhere, hits the guy, the car exits stage left, there you go. Why can't you write this? Well, what kind of a car is it? Would it result in a fatality? What angles would it need to hit the person for it to result in a fatality? What about body size? What about speed? It was endless, all of the little threads that I had to research in order to convincingly render either the events in the book or the perspectives in the book. So it did involve a lot more research than I thought I needed.
Yeah.
And actually, some of the research, I make it sound like I don't enjoy it. The truth is I do enjoy it. And one of the things that I discovered was that the Coachella Valley, for example, is known for its palm trees and the dates that are produced there. And there's a whole culture around those dates. So for example, in the 40s and 50s, they used to have like these date festivals, and people would come out and they would have, people dressing up as Middle Eastern people with like costume parties. It was an era where the popular perceptions of the Middle East were not what they are today. And so it was very much orientalized in a very different way than what it is today. There was this whole culture around it of date festivals, date shakes. The high schools football teams had names like the Sultans and the Sheiks and the Arabs. And then of course, now the Arabs have been renamed the Mighty Arabs because because a group complained about the mascot. The mascot is wearing a keffiyeh and has kind of a hooked nose, so it's not a great mascot. So there's all these kinds of things that are happening in the Coachella, and I thought it was so interesting how these perceptions of peoples change depending on political events. And then there's also things about the landscape, like how did dates come to be associated with the Coachella Valley. It turns out that in the 1920s, a botanist for the USDA was traveling in North Africa looking for the perfect species of date that could be imported to the United States and grown here. And he settled on one that grows in the oasis of Boudnib in Morocco. And I found that, I was like, I gotta use this in the book. So sometimes research can be fun, but really I use it as a way to create the illusion, just the illusion of authority in the voice.
And you've talked a little bit now about this notion of the Mojave and where you were and the connection to Morocco. So can you talk a little bit, because the landscape is a big part of this book.
Yes. So I was born in Rabat, which is the capital of Morocco, and I lived in London. I went to school in London for a bit, and then I've been living in LA for the last 20 years. So I've always lived in big metropolises, and I had never been to the desert, despite what people might imagine, my being from Morocco and all. But about 8 or 9 years ago, my husband and I started going out to the Mojave, to Joshua Tree and the areas around it to, go camping and go hiking.
So you're one of the tourists that they talk about in the novel.
Yes, exactly.
That the locals make fun of.
Yes,
Okay.
exactly. I was one of those. And something about the desert really spoke to me. I just found that I fell in love with it, and I decided that I wanted the story to be set there, partly because I loved the landscape and I wanted a chance to write about it and to describe it. One of the things that happened in the course of writing the Moor's account is that I kind of taught myself how to write more about landscape and to use it in narrative. And so in this book, I saw the Mojave as like an opportunity to write about this landscape. But the other reason is that in setting a story about a hit and run, I didn't really want to set it in a big city, just because if, let's say I decided to put it in LA, it would be 8 or 9 million people, and if it's a random hit and run, how do you bring that sense of suspense and that sense of feeling that the person who's sitting next to you at a restaurant or somewhere else might be the person behind the wheel? You can't do that in a big city, but if you move it to a tiny little town, you can use that. And so that was another reason. So one was just sort of selfish reason, which is the wanting to write about the landscape, but the other one was very much a craft reason, like, because I felt that it would help the story.
Okay. And now, a little change of topic, but the book is obviously about family and the relationships within this family, and it's about grief, obviously, is a huge component of this, and change. But there seems to be an underlying issue of deception between the characters. Obviously, there's a mystery component which creates deception, but within the family themselves, even to the point that there's one character, Salma, who only gets one chapter of one voice, but that deception is unknown to everybody else, but we know about it. So, I mean, was that inherent in what you're looking at as from...
Well, it's interesting. I wonder why that is. I wonder if that happened because of the fact that this is, in some sense, a mystery. But in writing from the first-person perspective, I had the opportunity to really know everything about the character, to know everything, their entire past, all of their secrets, all of the things that they know about themselves that other people don't know about them, the jealousies, everything. And it was such an opportunity that I felt I could not pass up. We, all of us, have very private, intimate lives that even the people who are closest to us might not always guess at. And when you have 9 different perspectives and they're all in the first person, of course those secrets are going to be revealed to the reader, and that the sort of those private jealousies and the sort of less savory aspects of each one of us. That's what makes us human, and that's what the writing from the first person gave me, and I wanted to be able to use that in the book.
Okay. And you know, so you have all these characters, you've inhabited them all, and there are storylines, obviously, here that we explore only in pieces because they're not the central component, but we get pieces of them. You know, the Detective Coleman's son and the issues there. And this is maybe an awful question to ask, but have you considered potentially ever revisiting any of these characters down the road?
Why is that an awful question?
I don't know. I don't want to say sequel, but I was engaged with a number of these people by the end of the book, but we don't necessarily see where they wind up.
Yeah. No, I do feel like I've reached a sense of closure with the book, and I don't feel that I have to spend more time with each of the characters. I feel that the point is that readers get to see and to experience for the duration of the book the limitedness of our personal perspectives and how hard it is, really, to see things from another person's point of view. And once that effect has been achieved, and once the sort of big mystery has been resolved, and some of the storylines have reached their closure, I did not find it necessary to close each single one in turn. These characters are unresolved, on purpose.
Okay. And I want to ask you a question about the characters, but also about the notion of language. Your native language was not English. It's your third language that you came to. Mm-hmm. You and I talked earlier today about why you write in English, which I think is fascinating. And I think if you could explain to us a little bit about why you write in English, then I want to ask you another question about the characters.
Okay. Yes. So I started. So I grew up in Rabat, and I spoke Moroccan Arabic in the home. But then I was sent to. My parents sent me to a French grade school where it was the primary language was French, but we also got some instruction in modern standard Arabic. And then in high school, I started learning English. So I started learning English when I was 15, I think. In terms of writing in English, I started writing in French because most of the children's literature to which I had been exposed, as from a very young age, was in French. And part of that is a result of the colonial situation post-colonial situation that Morocco is in, where the most of the children's literature that was available in the 70s and 80s was in French. And it wasn't until I was a tween or a teenager that I really started seeing, and I was able to read, more adult material, that I was starting to be exposed to Moroccan stories with Moroccan characters. So after writing in French for some time, I ended up giving it up because it really felt to me to be an uncomfortable language. In the sense that all of the stories that I saw that were written about Morocco carried that sort of colonial gaze to them, and it was a gaze that was reflective of a very particular power, or a particular power imbalance, rather. And I just felt uncomfortable with that, and I ended up sort of giving up on writing. I did not really return to it until I was in graduate school, and by then I was working on my dissertation, which obviously I was writing in English because I was doing a PhD at USC, and at that point, since I was writing a book in English, I thought, well, perhaps I could try my hand at writing fiction in English, and now here we are. I think.
Well, I was going to say we'd like to have some time for questions. So if people want to step up to the microphones, if they'd like to ask a question, I'm going to ask you one while people come up, which just goes to this question of language, which is some of these characters obviously are thinking and living and working in different languages. So I'm kind of curious, what was your thought process around them, and as you were inhabiting their voice? English, Spanish, Arabic, what was your thought about that?
I think there is often an assumption that because a novel is written in English, that everybody in that novel is speaking in English, and I find that is not reflective of my experience. I live in Los Angeles, which is a city that is home to a very large immigrant population. 40% of the people who live in Los Angeles are foreign-born. So it is very much a multilingual space. And there is nothing, it seems as if it's a modern phenomenon, and it's not. So for example, in the Moor's account, again, people assume that the experience of conquest was conducted by white men, that it was, sort of a monolingual experience, and that's not really the case. These expeditions oftentimes involved people of different backgrounds and who spoke different languages. And so the moment of contact was not just between people who spoke Spanish and people who spoke one indigenous language, but between people who spoke multiple European and African languages and people who spoke multiple indigenous languages. And it was something that I tried to sort of render in the Moor's account. And in this book, which is set in California, obviously there are two characters here who are Moroccan, whose native language is Arabic, but their children, the native language is English. So I sort of try to inhabit these voices and to periodically sort of remind the reader that there are all these other languages interacting with each other at the same time as people are interacting with each other. This is not a monolingual country. It never was, and it is not then and not now. And I think that this is something that fiction ought to reflect as well, in that the characters also, while the book is rendered in English, it does have this sense that people are speaking other languages.
Thank you so much. We have a question over there.
أهلا.
Your book was great. And Kitab Mantas and Mamnunik Asted. My question is on language and culture and literature. Probably the best book on the desert, Al-Teh, by Abdurrahman Munif, which was brought to life by, in English by Jacqueline Onassis Kennedy with Peter Thoreau, even though Mrs. Jacqueline Onassis said she had to rewrite most of what Peter translated. But my question is, Abdurrahman Munif's book is now titled Seas of Salt. Did you use, and there's obviously Leilat Wa Enta is a love story based in, did you use any of this Arabic literature and stories in your writing? And also, do you plan to, the Moor's account, do you plan to write it in Arabic?
Okay, so thank you very much for that question. In terms of Cities of Salt, I didn't rely on Arabic stories for this particular book because of the fact that I think of this book as an immigrant story set in America. So most of what I've been reading most of what I read while I was working on this book are the following. Crime stories, because I needed to teach myself how to write suspense and how to write, mystery. Stories set in the West, because I was writing about the landscape of the West. Stories about immigration, because many of the characters in this book are immigrants. Stories about war, because one of the main characters is a veteran and I needed to write convincingly about that experience. So, in short, I read with a very deliberate goal in mind for each of the characters and trying to enrich my language and my perception in order to be able to write from their perspective. So for this reason, I didn't really rely on anything like Cities of Salt. I will tell you two things, though. One is, I believe, was it Jacqueline Onassis? I forget who it was, but Edward Said, the late Edward Said, had this story to tell about how he had been trying to get people to translate Naguib Mahfouz. This was long before the Nobel, to try and interest New York editors in translating his work into English. And he was told that there was no market for this because Arabic was perceived as a political language. So that's, I think I thought about that because Jacqueline Onassis was one of the people who had been pitched that book. And with respect to the Moor's account, it has been translated into Arabic by a woman named Noof Maimouni, and it is out with Dar Athar Publishing, and it came out last year. Because I'm working on another book.
A question over there?
Hi. Talking of languages, I learned that English is your third language. I'm here.
Okay.
And I come from a similar background where English is my third language. Telugu is my mother tongue. Hindi is my another language that I grew up with. But when I'm trying to write as just a part-time, when I write my poems or stories, I find that some ideas and some thoughts get easier in Hindi, which is a language that I heard a lot. But when I'm writing stories, I prefer English more. And the ideas and poems that go with one language don't go with another language somehow. I don't make that distinction. Something happens in my thought process. I don't know which is my true self. I kind of, when you were talking about it, I kind of thought about the same thing. Which is my true expression? Does language choose the ideas themselves, or is there a compartmental, something happening within my mind that is choosing all that?
Yeah. That's such an interesting question, right? I mean, I wish that we had the awareness to say, I am thinking this thought in this, particular language in my head, and now I'm writing it in this other language, and I think it's much more fluid than that. I don't know that it's as compartmentalized or as deliberate as we might think it is. It really is more fluid and more instinctual, I would say. So when I write, obviously I'm writing in English, but I am thinking about the character as he or she is thinking in their language. I wish I had a way of explaining how that translation happens, but I don't. There is a line, I believe it's from Shame by Salman Rushdie, that goes something like, I am a translated man. So I think I am a translated woman.
One more question, probably.
Thank you for a very powerful and lovely book. You started by saying this book came to you as you grappled with your father's illness in 2014. Could you talk a little bit about, as you wrote the book, what you learned from the journey of your characters as, from 1981 through the setting of the book, and what that might say to young people who, like you at one point in time, were contemplating immigrating to another country?
But don't do it. I joke. I think that it's definitely, writing this book has given me the opportunity to explore that decision of immigrating from many different perspectives. Obviously from the perspective of the mother and the father and their children, and also from the perspective of the witness, who's this undocumented worker who sees the crime, and his children, who are US citizens as well. So I think it's just given me even more empathy for people who immigrate, whether it is by choice or by chance. So it's just, this is the weird thing, is that you need empathy in order to write, because you use imaginative empathy in order to write, but the very process of doing it actually grows your empathy muscle even more. So I would say that writing this book has given me even more empathy for immigrants and everything that they go through, whether it is, as I said, immigration by choice or by chance. I don't know if that answers your question.
It does. Thank you.
Well, I think, thank you all very much, and I want to thank you, Laila. This has been a wonderful program, and if we could all just thank Laila for what she's done.
Thank you. Thank you.